You don't know about the Bataan Death March. What happened was there were soldiers, this was in the Philippine Islands, Americans, and when Pearl Harbor hit, they also hit the Philippines. They were going south to Indochina. They were going down to Dutch East Indies where they could get fuel, and into Burma to get rubber, so their tanks and so on, because they were almost out of fuel, the Japanese were, and could hardly fight anymore, so they had to go down there. Okay, the Americans were on these islands, and they fought and fought till they were out of food, they were out of ammunition, and then the Japanese gathered them up. And they marched these guys, I don't know the exact figure, maybe 50, 60, 70,000 troops, and marched them 50 miles to a railhead without food, without water, and if one American would fall down, they'd bayonet him. That was known as the Bataan Death March. And if you think that any GI, like myself or anybody else, would show sympathy for a race like that, and they've kept this quiet, the rape of Nanking quiet, because MacArthur did not want to embarrass the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito. And they kept it quiet. It's now coming out, and people are talking about it. So when you think, you know, those poor people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, leaflets were dropped there prior to the dropping of the bomb and said, please vacate this city, we're going to blow it to pieces. They didn't heed it. The military of Japan would still be fighting. They wouldn't give up even then, because the Japanese philosophy, the soldier, is death for the emperor. They would die. That was an honor to die. Our soldiers don't feel that way. We want to, you know, get out of there. So, you know, we were fighting fanatics, and it was estimated that 1 million troops would die going into the island of Japan. So when we dropped that bomb, they didn't kill any more in Hiroshima and Nagasaki than the Japanese slaughtered in Nanking. I think the majority of the guys our age that grew up had a certain camaraderie and a certain amount of, we knew that we had to pay our way. Nobody gave us anything. And as a result of that, I think I wouldn't change my generation or any generation, because I know what my generation did, and I'm not sure what your generation is going to do.
It's my pleasure to welcome each of you to the 3rd annual Perry High School Veterans Day celebration. I'm Denny Glick, and I'm proud to be a part of this year's Veterans event. At this time, I call your attention to the American flag that is mounted on the wall of the gym. This flag is a memorial to Dan Garber, a Perry High School graduate and a great young man in every way. As most of us know, Dan is the son of Mike and Jerry Garber and Kathy Garber. Dan was a Navy petty officer and lost his life in a helicopter crash during a training mission in Crestline, California in March of 1998. A short time ago, all of us were shocked to hear of the tragedy that occurred in Yemen. On October 12th, 2 individuals blew themselves up in an attempt to destroy the USS Cole, a guided missile destroyer. 15 naval men and women lost their lives, and 39 were injured. Many of these men and women were about the same age as some of you, the average age 24 years, and it included 5 sailors only 19 years of age. Some were fresh out of high school or college, and all had families and friends they left behind. They were serving our country with the goal of keeping us safe from harm. I'd ask that we all stand and have a moment of silence in honor of Dan Garber, these sailors, and other brave men and women who have given their lives for our country. Thank you. As a point of interest, the USS Cole that was attacked was named in honor of a United States Marine, Sergeant Darrell Samuel Cole, who was killed in the D-Day assault of Iwo Jima back in 1945. Sergeant Cole received the Congressional Medal of Honor, and the citation ended with, "He gallantly gave his life for his country." Today we have several veterans who have taken the time to share with us their knowledge and memories of being a veteran. Our first speaker, World War II veteran Jim Haas. Lieutenant Jim Haas was a bombardier on a B-17 bomber, also called the Flying Fortress. Jim is a longtime Perry resident and is active in many of the great things that Perry has happening. Please welcome Jim Haas. Today I'm going to tell you about the origin of Veterans Day. In 1921, an unknown soldier, American soldier, was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. Many people came to the burial, and a military ceremony was performed for the unknown soldier. On November 11th, people began to celebrate the end of World War fighting, ending the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A memorial ceremony for the unknown soldier was included during the celebrations. The day was christened Armistice Day. Armistice Day became a national holiday, so citizens and military soldiers could pay tribute to the unknown soldier and the ending of World War I. World War I was a war to end all wars, supposedly. However, World War I was not the last war American soldiers fought. More than 400,000 soldiers died in the war following the implementation of Armistice Day. To pay tribute and honor all those who served in American wars, a proposal was made to change Armistice Day to Veterans Day. In 1954, President Eisenhower signed a bill proclaiming November 11th as Veterans Day. In 1958, 2 more unknown soldiers were brought home. One killed during World War II, and the other killed during the Korean War. And they were buried beside the unknown soldier. Ceremonies took place on November 11th for the 3 unknown soldiers. In 1968, the recognition day of Veterans Day was changed to the 4th Monday in October. However, because November 11th was so significant to American history, the recognition date was reverted back to the original date of November 11th in 1978. During this change, there were only 3 unknown soldiers buried in Arlington Cemetery. In 1984, another unknown soldier killed during the Vietnam War was also buried beside the 3 unknown soldiers. Presently, an Army Honor Guard keeps vigil day and night at Arlington Cemetery. November 11th is now recognized as a day to pay tribute to and honor all American soldiers who served our country in the armed forces. I might say in 1979, our group went to the Arlington National Cemetery, and they had a special ceremony, and that's, if you're ever in Washington, D.C., I hope all of you have the chance to go out to the cemetery and watch the changing of the guard, and it's quite impressive, the ceremonies they have there. Thank you. Our next presenter is Francis Wilson, another World War II veteran. Francis was a private first class in the combat engineers and was involved in the Battle of the Bulge. Francis was one of last year's speakers, and this year he has the honor of making a very special introduction. Please help me welcome Francis Wilson.
I think about everybody here knows Cliff Struthers has lived in 3 centuries. Cliff was one of 11 children, born up around Galway someplace, and he volunteered for the Army when he was a teenager and went down to, he'd gone down to Camp Dodge. Later on, sent to Fort Logan, Colorado, where he told me he was given the uniform and was in the Coast Artillery. Went to the San Francisco Bay Area, and where they actually, he was in the Coast Artillery. And I asked Cliff, I said, how many live rounds did you ever fire? And he said, none. He said they done dry fire, timed again and again and again. As Cliff's career went on, he was shipped to Norfolk, Virginia, and went overseas. They was in a convoy, and was being escorted by destroyers. At a certain point out there, the destroyers kind of left them on their own. It was blackout, and he said that it was a luxury liner that had been converted to a troop ship. He was in the ballroom, and he said they had built up these bunks in a bunch of 2x4s and all that. The destroyers had left them all out there, and of course during the night, one section of the bunks collapsed. And of course he immediately figured that he'd been torpedoed. He went on into France, and I asked Cliff, I said, did you ever cross paths with Harry Truman? Truman was a battery commander in World War II, and he said, nah, it never happened. They moved him around from here to there and everything. On 2/22/19, Cliff boarded the Martha Washington. Was the name of the ship he came home in. George was his birthday, he's on the Martha Washington, comes back again and lands at Norfolk. Now on March 3rd, 99, Clifford Struthers was awarded the French Legion of Honor. That is the highest military honor that country can give. Now let's hear it for Cliff.
today, our guest speaker is Glen Theulen. Yes, Glen is another World War II veteran, but also Glen is a veteran of the Korean War. In World War II, Glen was a Navy seaman first class and worked as a torpedoman on a destroyer escort in anti-submarine warfare. In the Korean War, Glen was an Air Force sergeant. Glen attended Perry schools from kindergarten all the way through graduating from high school. Along with his military roles, he graduated from Buena Vista College, was a teacher, a coach, and a railroader. He earned his master's degree in Indiana and eventually ended up moving out to the East Coast. Glen moved back to Perry in 1989 and has played an active role in many ways to help Perry. The caboose was brought back to town by Glen to help us learn of and remember our railroad heritage. And Glen was instrumental in planning and directing the Sentimental Journey, a community event that took place a couple months ago that showed what life was like in Perry when the soldiers came home from World War II back in 1946. Glen has also planned several memorial events at Perry's Veterans Memorial. And Glen has done these things and more. We're looking forward to what Glen might have up his sleeve for the future for Perry. It's my pleasure to introduce Glen Theulen.
Just for a moment, in keeping with the theme of World War I, the Armistice Day, the boys come marching home, I'd like to read to you the poem In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. You must understand I am not an English major, nor did I really participate that much in poems, but I'll give her a go. This is for you, Cliff. In Flanders fields the poppy blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. I would like to thank quite sincerely from the heart Mr. Lipovac and Mrs. Kaufman for connecting not only the citizens of Perry, but the school children of Perry, the high school kids that are here, to your past, to World War II. Do you realize that in World War I and World War II, more service people were killed in those two wars than all of the recorded wars in history? Period. We enjoy freedom. That's our birthright. That's what we believe is ours. Well, how did we get that? It was fought for from 1775 to the present day. And how did we win it? We did it simply by our men giving the most precious gift they could give, themselves, and sometimes their lives. December 7th, 1941, as I told the young people across the hall, I was at the Perry Theater enjoying a Sunday afternoon movie, which was the kind of thing that all high school kids did during that period of time. All of a sudden, the show was stopped, and Mr. McKinnon got on the stage and said, "I'm very sorry to announce this, but the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Of course, we all went home. School was canceled the next day. Next morning, December 8th, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke to Congress. I'll just get a little of what he said. Yesterday, December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. And then it goes on, and he finally ended by saying, I therefore ask that a state of war now exists between the United States and Japan. I was laying on the floor in the front room of my house, listening to that speech, and my mother was lying on the couch next, listening to it. At that point in time, the total troops of the United States Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard was a fantastic total of 350,000 men. 1941, 1 month left in the year 1941. By 1945, there was 16 million men and women in our armed forces. December 8th, men flocked to the enlistment offices to do their duty. Our equipment was old, our equipment was obsolete. We were not prepared for war. The Congress, at that particular time, we had people that did not want us to enter war. So we were totally unprepared. They trained with broomsticks for rifles and trucks for tanks. We were totally unprepared. But America didn't take long. It did not take long at all. The productivity just was immense. Ships were built, airplanes were built, tanks were built. We geared ourselves up. The industrial might of this country reached its peak. The home front, the same way. Everyone was behind the war 100%. Solid home front background. The farmers worked in the fields to feed the troops. It was a tremendous effort. You have to remember that we were coming out of a depression. We were coming right out of a depression. We didn't have cars to go to school. We walked. We didn't have the luxuries of life. Why in the world would the men of my generation go to war when we really had nothing? We were given nothing. Why would the African Americans go to war for this country? They were segregated. Why would the Asians go to war? One of the most decorated outfits in the Army were the 442nd Division of Nisei, Japanese Americans in Italy. They fought the war. Why would the Indians living on reservations go to the war? Because they believed in one thing. They believed in this country. They believed even in the limited freedom they had. They believed in this country. Out here in our audience right now, if you turn around and look, these are the young people that went to war. Do you realize that almost 70% of all members of the services were killed were between the ages of 18 and 24? 400,000 died. We had 140 million in the population of the United States, and out of that, 400,000 died. This is a question I've asked myself many times. Why would young men and women of the Depression era, and why would these groups, who were so segregated, fight for their country? But we did. We did. It didn't make any difference. Why did we go? Because we had to go. It was our duty to go. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Now, we'd fought our way all the way up through Africa, into Sicily, into Italy. We fought in the jungles in New Guinea, island hopping up to the Philippines. And finally, June 6, 1944, we were going to actually move across the English Channel and attack the enemy for the first time. And again, I'll give you just a little what Dwight D. Eisenhower said to the troops before embarking on that tremendous day in June. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere are with you. after bitter fighting on the Omaha and Utah beaches, the liberation of Paris, and the terrible Battle of the Bulge, Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. At the same time, a little earlier in the month of February, the Marines and Army attacked the island of Iwo Jima. 20,965 casualties. Mr. Glen Jacobson, sitting right out here, was on that island for 29 days. That island was as wide as from Willis Avenue to Paul Street, and would stretch to Dawson. It was flat. The Japanese were dug in underground, and they fought. They were told in 3 days they could conquer that island. It took them 32, is that right, Jay? 20,965 casualties. On April 1st, 1945, we went into Okinawa. 49,200 casualties. Those two islands, there were more people killed on those two islands than anywhere else in the South Pacific. And when Harry Truman dropped that bomb, you can bet that every Marine, every soldier, and every sailor looked to the sky and said, thank God, because it was estimated there would be 1 million casualties had they gone into the main island of Japan. Now, when I look back at this, I think of that day when I was laying on the floor listening to Roosevelt's speech, and I looked at my mother laying there. Well, my mother died December 11th, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. And when I was young, I didn't think about what my mother thought. I was young, 16 years old at that time. 17 years, I graduated. 17 years, I enlisted immediately afterward because I knew where I was going. And I thought, years later, in retrospect, I said, what was my mother thinking? I never would know. But I wonder over here if what Richard King's mother said and thought when she got the telegram, or Homer Westford, or Ed Fitzgerald's mother. I knew those guys. We had a commitment, and we carried out our commitment. I miss them, but we did what we had to do. There's one thought as I close there that I want to leave with you, and I want you to listen to this and understand. Because when you see a serviceman today, you connect with him because he's there for your freedom, and don't forget it. This is a quote from Father Dennis Edward O'Brien, United States Marine Corps chaplain. It is the soldier, not the reporter, who has given us freedom of press. It is the soldier, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It is the soldier, not the campus organizer, who has given us the freedom to demonstrate. It is the soldier who salutes the flag, who serves beneath the flag, and whose coffin is draped with the flag, who allows the protester to burn the flag. God bless all of you here, and God bless the veterans that I'm so proud to be a member of, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Please wear a poppy, the lady said, and held one forth, but I shook my head. Then I stopped and watched as she offered them there, and her face was old and lined with care. But beneath the scars the years had made, there remained a smile that refused to fade. A boy came whistling down the street, bouncing along on carefree feet. His smile was full of joy and fun. "Lady," he said, "may I have one?" When she'd pinned it on, he turned to say, "Why do we wear a poppy today?" The lady smiled in her wistful way and answered, "This is Remembrance Day, and the poppy there is the symbol for the gallant men who died in war. And because they did, you and I are free. That's why we wear a poppy, you see." I had a boy about your size, with golden hair and big blue eyes. He loved to play and jump and shout. Free as a bird, he would race about. As the years went by, he learned and grew, and became a man, as you will too. He was fine and strong, with a boyish smile, but he seemed with us such a little while. When war broke out and he went away, I still remember his face that day. When he smiled at me and said goodbye, "I'll be back soon, Mom, so please don't cry." But the war went on and he had to stay, and all I could do was wait and pray. His letters told of the awful fight. I can still see it in my dreams at night, with the tanks and guns and cruel barbed wire, and the mines and bullets, the bombs and fire. Till at last, the war was won, and that's why we wear a poppy, son. The small boy turned as if to go, then said, "Thanks, lady, I'm glad to know. That sure did sound like an awful fight, but your son, did he come back all right?" A tear rolled down each faded cheek. She shook her head, but didn't speak. I slunk away in a sort of shame, and if you were me, you'd have done the same. For our thanks in giving is oft delayed, though our freedom was bought and thousands paid. And so when we see a poppy worn, let us reflect on the burden borne by those who gave their very all when asked to answer their country's call, that we at home in peace might live, then wear a poppy, remember, and give.
Coming up to the podium now is Ellen Reiske, Superintendent of Perry Schools, and although not a military veteran, Ellen quickly became a veteran of Perry Schools, leading us in a victory in the battle for a new high school. With her are two Vietnam veterans and Board of Education directors, Chuck Painter and Gary Huitt. Please give them a warm welcome.
This past year, the Iowa legislature authorized the Department of Education to award an honorary diploma to all honorable World War II veterans who served their nation but were interrupted from completing their high school degree. And 3 residents from Perry applied, and we are very privileged today to be giving them honorary degrees. And I'm going to read a little bit about each one of them, and Director Painter and President Huitt will hand out the diplomas. And our first honoree today is Robert McMichael. Mr. McMichael enlisted in the United States Navy in 1941 when he was just 17 years old. He served as a gunner's mate, 3rd class, aboard the USS Tennessee. He was stationed at Pearl Harbor shortly after its bombing, and then in Washington. After his honorary discharge, he returned to Perry and went directly into the workforce, never having the opportunity to finish high school. His wife, Lorene, is accepting his diploma on his behalf today, and would she please come forward? Our second honoree today is Billy J. Hancock. Mr. Hancock enlisted in the United States Air Force 379th Division the summer after his junior year in high school. He spent 2.5 years in England during the war and flew over 300 missions as his crew's gunner. After his honorary discharge, he returned to the States and taught at an Air Force school in Florida before returning to Perry to work at Bill's Safety Service, which is still in business. His wife, Gladys, is accepting his diploma today on his behalf. And our last honoree today is Emery W. Schneider, Jr. Mr. Schneider enlisted in the United States Navy in 1943, just a month after his 17th birthday. He served aboard the USS Minotaur, the USS Kent Island, and the USS Guinessar, and was honorably discharged with the rank of Fireman First Class. Mr. Schneider lives in Cedar Rapids and regrets he cannot be here today. Mr. Glen Theulen will accept this diploma on his behalf. And again, on behalf of the Perry Community School District, we're absolutely delighted and privileged to participate in this program and hope that we will have more honorees next year. Thank you.
At a time in their lives when their days and nights should have been filled with innocent adventures, love, and the lessons of the workday world, they were fighting in the most primitive conditions possible around the bloodied landscapes of France, Belgium, Italy, Austria, and the coral islands of the Pacific. They answered the call to save the world from the two most powerful and ruthless military machines ever assembled, instruments of conquest in the hands of fascist maniacs. They faced great odds in a late start, but they did not protest. They succeeded on every front. They won the war. They saved the world. They came home to joyous but short-lived celebrations and immediately began the task of rebuilding their lives and the world they wanted. They married in record numbers and gave birth to another distinctive generation, the baby boomers. A grateful nation made it possible for more of them to attend college than any society had ever educated anywhere. They gave the world new science, literature, art, industry, and economic strength unparalleled in the long curve of history. They now reach the twilight of their adventurous and productive lives. They remain, for the most part, exceptionally modest. They have so many stories to tell, stories that in many cases they have never told before, because in a deep sense, they didn't think that what they were doing was that special, because everybody else was doing it too. They came of age during the Great Depression and the Second World War and went on to build modern America. Men and women whose everyday lives of duty, honor, achievement, and courage gave us the world we have today. Tom Brokaw, The Greatest Generation.
This morning our soloist will be Muhs, and I would like you to join singing this God Bless America. I'll motion to you when to join us. Please do.
Call
We extend a big thank you to April Cook for her prelude and postlude music that will be coming up, to Gary Weissar and the Perry High Select Choir, Scouts Chad Mormon and Matt Holmes of Boy Scout Troop 127, and our speakers for making this assembly possible. Also, thank you to all the students, veterans, and guests who attended the event. Linda Kaufman and Tom Lipovac have organized this celebration from the start, and without them, and without the thoughtfulness of the Perry High Student Council, this Veterans Day celebration would never have gotten off the ground and grown as it has. Thank you all. Would everyone please stand for the retiring of the colors?
Going into Iwo Jima, we left Guam on the 16th of February and arrived at Iwo Jima on the 19th. We were supposed to be a floating reserve. 3rd Marine Division will never land. Before the first day was over, they were calling for us to come in. We went on the landing craft the second day, spent a solid day on landing craft because there were so many junk ships and boats and whatnot on the beach that there was no way that we could get in. So we went back to the ship. The 3rd day, we got in to and on the island about 4:30 in the afternoon. On the 5th day is the day they raised the flag. That to me means a lot. I was there and watched them raise the flag. When we talk about Mount Surbachi, where they raised the flag, it is a volcano is what it is. It's 560 foot high, and that is where they raised the flag. We are all so proud of it.
There was a lawyer once, his name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the National Anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game. We stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners and the British had prisoners. And the American government initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners. They said, we want to send a man out to discuss this with you. They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, we want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange. On the appointed day in a rowboat, he went out to this boat and he negotiated with the British officials, and they reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful, went down below in the boats, and what he found was a cargo hold full of humanity, men. And he said, men, I've got news for you tonight. You're free. He said, tonight I have negotiated successfully your return to the colonies. He said, you'll be taken out of this boat, out of this filth, out of your chains. As he went back up on board to arrange for their passage to the shore, the admiral came and he said, we have a slight problem. He said, we will still honor our commitment to release these men, but it'll be merely academic after tonight. It won't matter. And Francis Scott Key said, what do you mean? He said, well, Mr. Key, he said, tonight we have laid an ultimatum upon the colonies. Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or you see that fort right over there, Fort Henry? He said, we're going to remove it from the face of the earth. He said, how are you going to do that? He said, if you will, scan the horizon of the sea. And as he looked, he could see hundreds of little dots. And he said, that's the entire British war fleet. He said, all of the gunpowder, all of the armament is being called upon to demolish that fort. It will be here within striking distance in a matter of about 2.5 hours. He said, the war is over. These men would be free anyway. He said, you can't shell that fort. He said, that's a large fort. He said, it's full of women and children. He says, it's predominantly not a military fort. They said, don't worry about it. They said, we've left them a way out. And he said, what's that? He said, do you see that flag way up on the rampart? He said, we have told them that if they will lower that flag, the shelling will stop immediately. And we'll know that they've surrendered, and you'll now be under British rule. Francis Scott Key went down below and told the men what was about to happen. And they said, how many ships? He said, hundreds. The ships got closer. Francis Scott Key went back up on top and he said, men, I'll shout down to you what's going on as we watch. As twilight began to fall, and as the haze hung over the ocean as it does at sunset, suddenly the British war fleet unleashed. He says the sound was deafening. There were so many guns that there were no reliefs. He said it was absolutely impossible to talk or hear. He said suddenly the sky, although dark, was suddenly lit. And he says from down below, all he could hear the men, the prisoners, saying was, tell us where the flag is. What have they done with the flag? Is the flag still flying over the rampart? Tell us. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours into the shelling, every time the bomb would explode and it would be close to the flag, they could see the flag in the illuminated red glare of that bomb, and Francis Scott Key would report down to the men below, it's still up. It's not down. The admiral came and he said, your people are insane. He said, what's the matter with them? He said, don't they understand this is an impossible situation? Francis Scott Key said he remembered what George Washington had said. He said the thing that sets the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is he will die on his feet before he'll live on his knees. The Admiral said, we have now instructed all of the guns to focus on the rampart to take that flag down. He said, we don't understand something. Our reconnaissance tells us that that flag has been hit directly again and again and again, and yet it's still flying. We don't understand that. But he said, now we're about to bring every gun for the next 3 hours to bear on that point. Francis Scott Key said the barrage was unmerciful. All that he could hear was the men down below praying. The prayer, God, keep that flag flying where we last saw it. Sunrise came. He said there was a heavy mist hanging over the land, but the rampart was tall enough. There stood the flag, completely nondescript, in shreds. The flagpole itself was at a crazy angle, but the flag was still at the top. Francis Scott Key went aboard and immediately went into Fort Henry to see what had happened. And what he'd found had happened was that that flagpole and that flag had suffered repetitious direct hits. And when Huitt had fallen, but men, fathers, who knew what it meant for that flag to be on the ground, although knowing that all of the British guns were trained on it, walked over and held it up humanly until they died. Their bodies were removed and others took their place. Francis Scott Key said what held that flagpole in place at that unusual angle were patriots' bodies. He penned the song, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Or the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet fly and wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" The debt was demanded. The price, it was paid.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets spread clear, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave Spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Not the me. They found out in the service that the material things that you have can be replaced, but your life cannot be. And I think that you young people are seeing a great example of why you have the freedoms you have today, because these guys fought for it.
They left their farms and factories, their offices and classrooms. 16 million Americans in uniform. 400,000 gave their lives for freedom. For the first time, young women eagerly entered the workforce to supply the arsenal the world depended on for victory. But this was no faceless mass that went to war. They were my relatives and yours, our fathers and mothers, our grandparents and next-door neighbors. They were our family's heroes. And yet, unbelievably, there's no national monument anywhere to honor the amazing generation that won World War II. I'm Tom Hanks. Please help build the National World War II Memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Call 1-800-639-4WW2. That's 1-800-639-4992. It's time to say thank you.
A public service message from the American Battle Monuments Commission, the Ad Council, and this station.